Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. Let's go to our next story, and that is, it deals with the issue of voting. You would think the people who struggle with economic hardship would be more likely to get involved in their political process, but studies have shown that that's not necessarily the case. That leads, of course, a vicious cycle. Poor folks not voting. Politicians who don't represent their interest are elected, and they then make it even harder for poor people to vote. Let's talk about this with our next guest. She is Economist Dr. Kristen Broady of Alabama A&M University. Dr. Broady, this was quite an interesting piece here, where you break down that the people who are most impacted by public policy, who are poor folks, are the ones who are not going to the polls in the numbers that they should.
Absolutely, Roland. Thank you so much for having me. Voting really is about a couple of things: political interest, motivation, and ability. But when you're trying to figure out who's going to take care of your children, how you're going to get to work, what you're going to put on the table for dinner, you don't really have the wherewithal to get involved in voting. The opportunity cost is just too high. And if we can convince you to get involved, there's still the ability. How do you get there? How do you get to the polls? And once you do get there, there's a long line, and you get to the front of the line, and they tell you that you don't have the right ID, that you're not on the list, that you're at the wrong place, or you get there and the place that they told you to come to is closed. So you made the sacrifice to come and vote, and now you can't. You're unlikely to make that sacrifice again.
Well, and this is also why I keep trying to explain to folks that we have to understand why voter suppression, why Republicans are doing all they can, because they want to frustrate people. They want to make it more difficult, and they don't want folks who are poor, who are working, who are trying to improve their lives. They don't want them going to the polls because that's why they precisely don't talk about them. They don't talk about, no one talks about the poor. They talk about the middle class, the middle class, the middle class, the middle class. You swear that the only classes that exist in America is the middle class and the rich people.
Right, and if people knew how important voting was, then they would get to the polls, right? If we could convince them, if we could make a way for them to get there, if we could have buses to take them, if we could have voter registration, but they're shutting all of that down. They're saying that you can't take buses of elderly people to vote. They're saying that you can't have these various voter registration drives. So if you prevent people from understanding how important voting is, then they won't vote. And when politicians look at who's voting for them, if it's not poor people, then why are they going to go and listen to some people or cater to some people that aren't voting in the first place? That's the whole paradox. Keeping the poor people, especially African Americans, out of the voting process, keeping them from being able to vote to change their situation.
Dr. Carter, this is one of the reasons why I often talk about having to connect the dots, where you have to have folks who are having very direct conversations with poor people and saying, let me explain to you how the person who is in office, whether you voted or not, how that has a direct impact on your economic well-being.
Well, I think people know that intrinsically. They just don't know how it matters.
Actually, they don't. To be perfectly honest with you, they don't.
Okay,
I traveled this country,
I'm just a political scientist who actually does this. But I'm saying that I may not know the specifics.
Let me ask you then. Let me ask you then. I want to unpack that. Okay. Because what's interesting is, when I travel this country and interviewing people in town halls, it's amazing to me how when we're having conversations, folks will say, oh, I didn't realize when I'm voting on education, I'm looking to my state rep or I'm looking to a member of Congress, and they go, I'm not voting in school board elections. Right. And I'm like, well, that's actually where your most impact on education. Or then when you talk about public policy, when you talk about roads and things along those lines, I've had folks say, oh, I thought I was talking to my member of Congress, but really, roads is my county government.
Well, absolutely. I'm not saying that there's not an education gap, right? That people don't need to know the difference between state, local, and federal distinctions. But to say that people have no sensibility that these things actually matter to their lives, they do know that. Because when you are seeing things like in the last 4 years, rolling back the number of places you can poll, right, or vote places you can vote, rolling back your opportunities to vote early, right, because time and money are most valuable resources that people can have when we're talking about voting, whether it's gathering information or taking the time. And since it's not a holiday, people don't actually have a lot of time, and a lot of employers don't give people paid leave to go actually go vote. So people know that these things are happening. We saw what happened in Georgia. The most polling places that were closed in black districts, overwhelmingly poor districts, because these are the people who are most easily disenfranchised, and they're easily disenfranchised because they don't have lots of time or money. It's the same reason that young people are easily to dissuade from voting. We've known this for years, but we also know that there are other things that people do to counteract these forces in their lives, right? So people actually don't just sit there and say, I'm not going to do these things. They may not do all of the things, right? And I think people have this idea.
Here's what I mean by connecting the dots.
I'm sorry?
Here's what I mean by connecting the dots. Here's what I mean by connecting the dots. I don't mean just in terms of polling locations. What I mean is like I experienced this in 2016. At a radio show, numerous folks would call in and they would say, you know what, I'm not feeling Hillary Clinton. I don't like Donald Trump. And you know what, I'm just going to focus on my state. Okay, so I'm having this conversation. Now, remember, it was specifically with a sister in North Carolina. And I said, okay, what are the top 5 issues in your state? And she said, well, one of the things I'm really concerned about, to your point, is voting. And I said, okay, explain that. And then, so she told me. And I said, now, you do know the role that the president, appointments, Department of Justice, Supreme Court, Congress has on your very issue. And we begin to go through it. So then she talked about HBCUs. And then I said, okay, you do know that the funding of HBCUs in North Carolina is not just the state legislature. It also impacts in terms of these initiatives in Congress. And we went through all 5. What was amazing is that she actually thought, and this was a college-educated sister who was a grassroots organizer, she thought she could check out of the process on the presidential level, on the senatorial level, the congressional level, and only focus on her states. And I said, no, they're all interrelated. So when I say connect the dots, what I mean is I believe there has to be more of a connecting the dots of folks to say, here's your station in life, and this is how politicians actually impact every facet of your life. And this notion that, oh, I want government out of my life is a fallacy, because government is in every aspect of your life, even if you don't think they are.
Absolutely. Nobody's disagreeing, but I think voter fatigue is real. And I think we have in our mind that citizens are the ideal citizens at all times, right? That people do their best at all times to participate in every part. And I think what's clear is that people don't have infinite reserves of energy, of time, of money. And so people do check out at different points. And it's not because they don't care. It's just like, it's a lot. All these voting times aren't the same time. We have primaries, we have general elections, then we have school board elections, we have city council elections. They're not held at the same time of year. They're held in off years, in fact. And we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about national elections and very little talking about state and local elections. So as you said, school boards, very important, right? But how much time do we really take up talking about those things so people do understand? I mean, we are not doing a good job in this country of raising civically minded individuals. We've actually done away with civic education, and that is in part why you see these disconnects. But it's not to say that people are bad citizens for not underlanding all of these things.
Can I just chime in, Roland?
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to Mustafa. I'm going to pull up Mustafa, and then I'm going to come right back to you. I'm going to bring him in for the reason because he's focused on the environmental issues. And Mustafa, that's also when I talk about how we connect the dots. How we, and again, so what I'm talking about is having a different approach to how we talk about voting. I think, Mustafa, the problem has been Elections coming up. It's the most, I can hear all the phrases. This is the most important election of your life. And it was like, well, I thought that the last one was. And then the previous one was. And the previous one, where I believe that groups that are out there who are trying to mobilize and organize have to speak to voters in a different way about public policy to get them out to the polls with different numbers. Mustafa, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what I share with folks around the country is that your vote equates to power, resource, and influence, and it happens on all the levels. When I talk to folks, I talk to them about the housing that's inside of their communities and how their vote can help to get better housing. And if you don't get engaged in that, then people are allowed to manipulate that process. I talk to them about the transportation routes. When you're not engaged in that process, people are going to put roads where they want to put them, and sometimes those roads will actually impact you by getting more pollution into your community. I talk to people about when you see these coal-fired power plants, incinerators, all this other stuff that's going on, it's because either we're getting engaged and utilizing our vote to get the right people in place who help to protect our communities, or we're allowing others to come in and fill that space and they're making decisions for us. And I also talk about how if you utilize your vote properly, we can get jobs back into our community. And that's for the city council, the county commission, on the state house, and on the federal level. But when we don't get engaged in that process, then others are making decisions for us. And usually when you frame it like that, most people don't want somebody else making a decision for them. And the other dynamic is, and you know, I just have to share this, we can't have voter fatigue. I get that. And I understand, you know, how people are working hard to put food on the table and pay the mortgage. But in many instances, we're only voting, say in a 4-year cycle, maybe 4 times, 5 times. So we spend a whole lot of time watching ball games. You know, you'll spend hours watching your favorite team. You'll spend hours standing in line to get into your favorite club or whatever it might be. So we make the time for the things that matter, but we have to make sure that our vote is actually tied to the real things that are happening in people's lives with real people who are running for office. And if you can't find somebody, you should run yourself, whether it's on the city level, the county level, or on the state level. And that's how we change this dynamic.
Kristen, go ahead.
I just wanted to agree with Dr. Carter and Mustafa that we can't have voter fatigue. We do need the information, but who did a good job was the Russians, and that's something that the State of Black America focused on. They put out all of these various things saying that they were Black Lives Matter activists. In fact, there were a number of posts that said that you could vote online. They looked real. Vote for Hillary Clinton just by clicking on this link or texting this number. It looked real. It had a real Black person's face, somebody who was supposed to be an activist. So who knows how many people believed that they were voting when they texted that number or when they clicked on that link. That's what we're combating.
Well, Kristen, that's also why, though, I'm a firm believer in getting folks to say, don't just follow anybody who call themselves an activist. Actually know who the hell they are. So if you've never actually seen them on Black shows, radio or television, or in Black media outlets, my suggestion, don't listen to them because they're likely fake. Kelly, I want to bring you in here. And the reason I've really, for the last several years, I've been stuck on this whole idea of how do we connect the dots? Because look, I've gone out with different voter groups, NAACP, Black Voters Matter, with rallies and things along those lines. And again, spent a lot of time talking to folks on the ground. But I go back to the Black Freedom Movement. I go back to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the citizenship education training programs they had. I go back to the freedom schools. I go back, so to Dr. Carter's point, the lack of focus on civics in our education process, to me, that's where we say, okay, since y'all not doing it, we're going to go back to grassroots to be able to connect those dots. So when you look at what Dr. Broady talked about in her column, the lower you go with the income, less likely folks are able to vote. If we are again re-educating our folks in a different way, and again being able to connect the dots, and the reason this thing is so personal to me because my parents were co-founders of a civic club where I grew up in Houston. And my mom eventually rose to become the co-chair of the Metropolitan Organization, which was a coalition of faith-based churches and others. And they would often, with City Hall, they held mayoral forums, they would go to the state legislature. But what I personally witnessed as they were walking poor people through this policy, how it impacts you. This housing development, how it impacts you. And they got soaked to the ground, or as Joe Madison say, put it where the goats can get it, as opposed to we always have these sort of high-level conversations. And so that's what I mean, Kelly, by, I think, looking at 2020 in a different way on how we connect the dots to black voters. Go ahead.
No, we absolutely need to connect the dots a little better. Your notion of this higher level of vocabulary kind of eluding people, that's definitely a thing. But when you're talking about, when you were saying in your memories regarding freedom schools and the like, the reasons why they worked so well outside of the content therein is because that was the only way you were getting that message. Right now we have to combat social media, the internet, other people, Russians, and anything and everything else therein. So it's not just coming from one person that you can trust. It's coming from 5 people that you look like you can trust. And that's the problem. So your idea of actually going straight to grassroots is an excellent idea, especially in lower income communities where there's still the inaccess to the internet is still a thing. You can definitely use that tactic there, but I also think you need to revamp the strategy a little bit outside of tradition, because we now have another entity involved.
Oh, no. And when I say grassroots, I'm not saying you only go to local, Christian. I'm not saying you only go to on the ground. What I'm saying is you use all the available tools, because I think you have to redefine the conversation. I think you have to explain it in a different way. So, perfect example, and this is going to be the last round for each one of you. I want you to comment. On Fox News, Richard Fowler was on, and they were talking about Trump reaching black voters. And he's a Fox News contributor. He's African-American. And so Harris Faulkner threw out there, well, what about, Trump signing the prison reform bill? And then I had a guy send me a tweet saying, hey, Trump has actually spent more money on HBCUs than President Barack Obama did. And so I replied to the guy, I said, well, first of all, I said there are multiple categories that HBCUs look at when it comes to funding. And so he was looking at this one source of funding. It was around $350 or $90 million. I said, but brother, but if you over here and you're cutting Pell Grants, I said, and 90% of HBCU's budgets are coming from students on financial aid. I said, that's actually a cut to HBCUs. I said, so you over here touting the $390 million. I'm over here looking at the billion that is being lost, but you're touting that. And I think as we're walking these things through, I think how we explain to people a policy. So, for instance, Trump can, and look, First Step Act, great. But the fact of the matter is this. On the federal level, there are 200-some-odd-thousand people in federal prison. There are 2 million in state prisons. And so when Trump is touting, oh, I signed the First Step Act. Okay, got it. But the greatest impact on prisons on the state level, and when you have a Department of Justice that wants to prosecute people at the highest level, when they don't want to have any oversight of police departments, when they have not filed a single action against all these crazy cops out here, then actually your policies are against black folks as opposed to supporting them. And I think walking people through and using every asset we have in order to get our folks to see politics differently than just Biden or Harris or this person, and say, no, this is how these policies will impact you and your pocketbook and your children and your children's children. So let me go to each one of you to close the show out. Kristen Broady, I'm going to start with you first. Go.
It's so interesting that you would say that. Representative Hakeem Jeffries was just at the State of Black America talking about the issue of incarceration and how there are 2.2 million people in prison and how there's no difference medically, chemically between crack cocaine and powder, right? But more African Americans end up going to jail for crack. So yeah, we need to do a better job of educating our own people about the policies that affect them, including Pell Grants, including funding for HBCUs, including voting. Because if we don't educate each other, especially with shows like this one, Roland, and thank you so much for this opportunity again, we need more shows like this, more information like this, because if we don't educate each other, the Republicans, the Russians, and others who definitely are not for us will do it.
Kelly, final comment.
No, I just agree with my panel here. Again, in terms of a communication strategy, you just have to take into consideration the new of what's going on, the new internet, the new social media, because the social media of 2020 is completely different from the social media of 2012, which is completely different from the social media of 2008, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to take everything into consideration, and you also just kind of have to get back to basics. There is nothing more impactful when it comes to voting and voting registration than face-to-face conversation and knocking on those doors. And even though it's laborious and tedious and all of those things, that's where the vote is. It's in the home. It's at the car when you put the flyer on the windshield. It's the human interaction. So for those who are, running for office or helping somebody run for office, keep that in mind, because even though you may not want to, it's definitely going to be the most beneficial to your campaign or your cause or your policy that you're trying to push.
Dr. Carter?
So I agree with everything my fellow panelists said. I think part of the notion we have to do is demystifying this process, right? In part about how do people run for office, what kind of offices are available to you, and showing people how they can actually do that, particularly at the local level, because there are lots of positions, some of which not even things you have to campaign for. I mean, let's be real, money is part of campaigns, but there are things you actually can do to have an effect on your community. And I think we have to start also talking about what our interests are again. I think that conversation got lost a little bit, but what are Black interests? And this is not partisan, but this is about what is better for your community. And if it just so happens one party has more of it than others, that's just what it is. But part of this is understanding what are Black interests and how are we defining those going forward. Because when we see those kids being detained by this same federal government, then we know that has implications for the way that our children are tracked from prison, from school to prison, right? And so we have to think about the sort of enlarging sort of what our universe is, and also being more discerning about what we allow in terms of information, because even some people who look like us were saying things at last election like, we can afford to lose one. This is not going to be a big issue, but we see how deathly wrong
they still
that
saying
was. And we'll say it to the day. That doesn't make them wrong though, right? And make them right. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't call it out when we see it and say, you know what, you actually did us a disservice with that statement.
Mustafa?
I just use simple country boy knowledge. It's real simple. If your policy or your platform is not going to improve my health, my wealth, or help to protect my life, you can't get my vote.
Well, my final comment on this is very simple. First of all, one of the reasons we use this show to walk folks through is so people understand how their daily lives are impacted by public policy. The amount of time I have spent, an inordinate amount of time, a city hall reporter, county government reporter, covering multiple city halls in Fort Worth, in Dallas, in Houston, in Chicago, all these years interviewing politicians. And the one thing that I have seen, and that is this here, the politician that is most effective about conveying a very basic and clear message to different groups of voters, that's who always wins. But I believe as African Americans, we can't look to politicians to craft messages that are going to get our people to vote. I fundamentally believe that we have to be the ones who are communicating in our homes, to our family members, then to our neighbors, then to folks on our street, then to folks on our block, then to folks in our neighborhood, then our city, then our state, then the country, utilizing churches and fraternities and walking people through the most basic thing is, and that's say, what's the number one thing you're concerned about? What's the number one issue that you care about? and then say, this is how this person who's running has an impact on that issue you're talking about. And what I've seen of people go, I never realized that this person had an impact on this issue. I thought it had nothing to do with it. That is critically important. So, and we can't wait. 2020 is next year. This has to be happening right now because it is so critical. Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.